Hello and welcome to the Prezi PowerPoint presentation on education and poverty in the developing world by Ashleigh Guimond, Robert Heyer, and Kyle Lantz. Here's a little roadmap of what we're going to be covering in our presentation. I'll be starting with the introduction. It is well known that areas throughout the world that are poverty-stricken have very little or no education available. It is a direct correlation that a country has a higher education levels produces a more successful nation. For our research and data collection, we chose to focus on the following regions: East Asia, the Pacific, Europe, Central Asia, Latin America, Caribbean, Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan African region. Data captured is from 1981 through 2010, and we control population and gross domestic product. Here are some sources. Education as a catalyst in rural development. Here we see a very basic definition of education. It is a process of socialization in which individuals acquire values, standards, norms, and knowledge to enable him to live a productive life in the society he lives in. Poverty is defined as the inability to meet basic needs such as nutrition, shelter, and clothing requirements. Environmental education is of uttermost importance to improving the conditions of poverty, especially in the areas that we chose. Increased levels of health and education are statistically shown to have negative impacts on income equality. Health can be used as a determinant of education because those who are healthy have the knowledge to become healthy, stay healthy, and seek attention when not healthy. Developing countries have much more to overcome than just enrolling their youth into primary school. The main problems that occur in Africa concern the environmental factor that must be kept in thought on a daily basis. Agroeconomic issues with the regions of Africa yield the nation from developing into a thriving country. Africa and nations like it have the resources needed to develop, but lack of education about their own environment is hindering that development. When the drought hits and patrons are uneducated on how to farm and tend to cattle, crop, and livestock die, leaving the men and women of Africa poor and hungry. Education is defined, as I have already stated. Educating the people of Africa is not only reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also a necessary survival tactics. It's a must in order to see development in the African nation. Environmental education is a process of creating harmony between the environment and humans. Sub-Saharan countries lack this education and therefore fall. Increasing the education starts with growth in numbers of those educated about the environment. Bakachari and Masama, two of our sources, make an important point when comparing education and poverty. They say that education is an important variable in the comparison because a more literate society will have greater awareness of the factors affecting health and therefore seek medical attention when needed. They make this point to support their hypothesis that improving health and education will reduce income inequality in Islamic countries. Their research shows that a $100 increase in per capita income in the previous period decreases poverty by 0.02%, holding all other variables constant. The study also shows that both the level of savings and education have negative effects on income equality. However, the latter is statistically significant. It is also known that higher education is positively correlated with reduced poverty. We have seen studies show over and over that underdeveloped countries struggle because they are uneducated. It is a vicious cycle to see that funds are not present to put forth towards education, and education is not there in order to seek funds. Our study is imperative to this topic by researching the number of pupils in the education system and how that will reduce the poverty of underdeveloped nations. Efforts to increase the number of pupils enrolled in primary education are beginning to snowball. Not only do we need to stress the importance of primary school, but increase the country's awareness of how to make use of their resources. A large part of being uneducated is being unaware. Our study will show that the more people that are aware and the more people that are enrolled in primary education, the less inequality we will see.
My name is Kyle Lantz, and for my section of the presentation, I will be covering the methodology and results. So to begin with the methodology, I will be covering the dependent variable, the primary independent variables, the control variables, and finally the statistical model that we used. So for our independent variable, what we used was the total number of poor people living under $2 a day per country. And we measured this in purchasing power simply to account for the disparity in the exchange rates or total wealth of a country between such a diverse group of countries. And the reason why we chose to keep that at a constant 2005 rate, again, similar reasons, is for the exchange rates, which can vary differently between countries. And the reason that we focused on the total number of poor people living under $2 a day is because $2 is the median measurement for poverty. You get it at $1, $1.25, all the way up to $5. And so $2 was kind of right in the middle, and it was also one of the most commonly measured statistics, most widely available statistics, and one used very often in literature. And so that's the reason why we chose to use this specifically. As you look at the slide, you can see there's more detail that you can feel free to read at your own available time. Moving on, we can see we have a bar chart here of the dispersion of the total number of people living under $2 a day in millions based on the country where they're located. Moving on to the prime independent variable, in this study, of course, we're trying to measure how education influences poverty. So our independent variable, our influencing variable, as you might hear, is primary education pupils measured in millions. And so the purpose of this was to measure the total number, or the maximum amount of students that you could measure in a country for primary education. And primary education was chosen because it's the most common education that would be utilized, especially in developing countries where there a lot of times may not be high schools or especially not tertiary education. And so primary education would encompass the greatest number of citizens in a country in the developing world. And so we chose to focus again on millions because, again, it keeps a nice synchronicity between all of our measurements. And we chose this statistic because, similar to the dependent variable, it was very widely used, it was widely available, and it was offered for those countries that we had chosen to study. Here you can see another bar chart showing the disparity, or the different representation values of each country's total education or primary education pupils measured in millions, with Mexico leading the charge. Moving on to our control variables, we had two control variables, and the ones that we chose to use we felt would have the greatest possible influence on the number of poor people living in a country, and so we chose two that were widely available, that were commonly used, and that had, in our opinion, a major influence on the number of people living in poverty. For those, we chose GDP at a constant 2005 US value. Similar to our dependent variable, we chose to use a constant 2005 measurement to control for inflation, to control for differences in inflation, or excuse me, not inflation, in exchange rates and other economic variables that could determine variance. And so the reason that we chose to use GDP is because GDP is a measurement of economic growth, a measure of economic outputs, and it's a good way of measuring how much a country is contributing to the global economy and potentially what the value of that country economically is. The second control variable we used was population, because population plays a major role in almost every single aspect of government policy, of government planning. And we felt like this would have a major role because population increases can affect the number of people demanding public services such as water, electricity, but also including things like education and police protection and other government services or public goods. And so for this reason, we chose to use population total per country, and then we cut that down into millions as well as a representative value. So the statistical model that we used to measure the correlation or causation that we saw here was a multivariate linear regression model. And as you can see in the displays below, there is the statistical model for that. And I'm not going to go through that in great detail because it's dry And so basically the reason we chose to use this model is because it represents changes or correlation between different variables as they increase or decrease. So we're saying that education has a positive influence on poverty, meaning that the higher the education statistic, the lower the poverty level should be. And so for that reason, we feel that as the education increases, poverty should decrease. And then we're controlling that, of course, with GDP and total population. Moving on to the results section, here we will be covering the relationships and influence, the multicollinearity problem, the coefficients statistics, and finally looking at a quick graphical representation of what this work provided. So moving on to the relationships and influence. Here basically what we did was two very basic statistical models, or tests, excuse me, an F-test, which basically just displays the statistical significance of how you either reject or accept the null hypothesis, with the null hypothesis being that the variables being the independent variables and control variables being education, GDP, and population combined have no effect on poverty. And because the F statistic, as you can see from the model at the bottom, is significant at the 0.05 level, we must reject this and say that these variables do have an impact on our dependent variable. Moving on to Pearson's R, this statistic basically indicates how much of an influence these grouped variables will have on our dependent variable, and basically it's trying to measure how much of an influence it has. So looking at the adjusted R squared, we can see that there is a 0.049 or a 49% influence between the grouped independent variables and the dependent variables. Unfortunately, this is not a very strong measurement. There you can see in the center the adjusted R squared model, and finally on the right you can see our F statistic. Moving on to multicollinearity. Multicollinearity, or just collinearity, is a necessary part of a linear regression because you of course want to have collinear connections between your dependent variable and your independent variable in order to measure some sort of change. However, multicollinearity, which is where the independent variables combine with each other and move in a similar direction, is something you want to avoid. In our model, you can see that with a little bit of math that is required, we can see that education, GDP, and population all have multicollinearity problems in which they are similar in their nature, higher than 65%, and population going all the way up to 90%. And this is a major problem for a statistical model. If you were to do this for, say, a journal article, or to revise this and try to do a deeper, more specific model, you would certainly address this issue. But for the reason I believe that this is occurring is because GDP and population are similarly linked. Rises in population often lead to rises in GDP, especially with the economic boom in developing countries, and education will generally increase as GDP increases. And so you can see there's a very logical reason why they share similarities. Again, on the right, you can see our collinearity statistic, and like I said, with a little bit of math, we get the percentages, which you can see right above them. So looking at the coefficients and significance, to break down the wall of text that you see there that explains it in greater detail, basically what we're saying is that the B statistic under the unstandardized coefficients represent how much of an influence each independent variable has on our dependent variable. And so we're saying that, as you can see, as education increases by about 1 million, you see a 1.46 million increase in the number of people living under $2 a day, which is interesting because that's the opposite of what we expected to see. And you can see for our dependent variables, GDP is the only one that had a negative impact on poverty. So as GDP increases by about 1 million, then poverty decreases by 2.5 million. And so that's interesting, a very common sense explanation that GDP tends to decrease the number of poor people. And population we disregard because it's statistically insignificant, and so is our constant, which is our dependent variable, because you can't have a population GDP of 0, and so clearly that makes no sense. There again is our model highlighted for the statistics we are specifically looking at. Moving on, we can see a quick graphic representation of the linear relationship between our dependent variable, which is located on the left-hand x-axis, which is the number of people living under $2 a day, and our primary independent variable, which is millions enrolled in primary schools, on the y-axis at the bottom. As you can see, it's very sporadic. There doesn't appear to be a very clear linear correlation between the two, and that is represented very easily in the statistical models. This has been Kyle Lantz and my presentation for University Fundamentals 300. I will leave you with Ashleigh to conclude our presentation. Thank you for your time.
My name is Ashleigh Guimond, and I will be discussing the conclusion as well as the relation to half the sky. During our conclusion, we will be covering the methodology, the results, a valid comparison, and making the connection. Methodology. The utilization of World Bank Data Bank was pivotal in the collection and research of each variable of use in this work. Future projects use these variable types may consider different levels of poverty, economic factors, educational indicators, and other control variables. The MLR model provides a good introductory level analysis and utility to analyze variables. Another consideration for future projects may be use larger samples over space and time, creating a cross-sectional time series paddle dataset to improve the statistical capabilities and accuracy of the analysis. Our results. All the analysis, charts, and graph production took place within an IBM SPS 22, which helped expand the analytical options compared to the handwork. We did not find the education had a positive impact on extreme poverty, and in fact was correlated with increase in poverty. There are numerous factors that could play into this, and due to the multi-culinary problems combined with the limited scope of this model, it would be disingenuous to make any real conclusion from this test alone. While this test fails to produce any new or conclusive evidence, we would suggest that it is still a success. The work has expanded ours, yours, and readers' minds on the subjects of extreme poverty and those factors that influence it. Additionally, it created an opportunity for us to utilize a number of academic disciplines in the accumulation of a single, multifaceted work. It does, however, raise more questions, especially if you were to conduct a cross-sectional time series analysis, because of the generational impact education could have over time. The relationship between education and poverty is clear. The relationship has been studied by numerous scholars who all came to a similar conclusion. The more people enrolled in a primary education will reduce the poverty gap. Our study will prove this hypothesis once again and specifically focus on developing countries around the globe. In Half the Sky, there are 3 stories that we have identified and how this relates. The first one is Fighting Slavery from Seattle. A school from Richmond, Washington called Overlake, where tuition is roughly $22,000 a year, students came together to help raise over $13,000 to help establish a school in Palan, Cambodia, near the Thai border. Money was raised by students conducting car washes, bake sales, and talent shows, all while educating themselves and the community about Cambodia's history and war on genocide. Each year, the school still sends a group of students and teachers to the Cambodian village to help teach English and work on the arts. And although some students in Cambodia are pressured by their families not to stay in school because of financial hardship or have no motivation to attend, the American Assistance for Cambodia started with the program Girls Be Ambitious. If a girl has perfect attendance in school for 1 month, she is given a $10 reward to her family. And although this doesn't resolve their problems, it certainly does help out and encourage the girls to stay in school and get an education. The next story is of the Afghan insurgent. It tells us of a story of a woman named Sakina. She grew up in a northwestern Afghanistan village and was accepted into college at the Kabul University, but was unable to attend due to the amount of violence there. So instead, she chose to attend a school in the U.S. in Stockton, California, at the University of Pacific as a pre-med student on a scholarship. After she completed her education there, she moved to Pakistan to work in the Afghan refugee camps. After facing many challenges and difficulties with the Taliban raiding and burning down buildings, she decided to take up her own risk and run a secret ring of schools for the girls. To make it work, she negotiated that if people supplied the houses and protect the students, then she would ensure the teachers get paid and provide all supplies. The operation was very successful. After the Taliban fell, Sakina moved to the Afghan Institute of Learning back in Kabul and is now able to provide education and other services for over 350,000 women and children in Afghanistan. There are 480 members staffed and 80% of them are women. Sakina quoted, "Education is a key issue for overcoming poverty and overcoming war. If people are educated, the women will not be abused or tortured." In part with education, her school also allows women to be offered classes with a range of skills that allow them to earn an income. They include sewing, embroidery, hairstyling, and computer science. The women who master computer skills can get a job as soon as they graduate and earn $250 per month. This is more than most men. In the final story, we're going to discuss investing in education. They follow the story of a girl named Dai Manju who lived in central China with her very poor family. The closest road to them was a 2-hour hike, and they had absolutely no possessions of any kind. They also shared their home with a large pig. Due to their impoverished state, the family could not see spending $13 a year to send Dai to an elementary school when they had better things to buy, such as rice to feed their family. An article was written in 1990 about Dai and her family, and after it was published, a sympathetic reader wired $10,000 to pay for her tuition. After a fair amount of the money had been spent, the donor was contacted to provide an update as well as a huge thank you. The startled man stated that he only donated $100, and it was discovered that the bank had made an error. But with the given circumstances, the bank contributed the rest of the money so they could continue and not have to take any of the girls out of school. The story continues to discuss the power of education. One study after another has shown that educating girls has helped them to fight poverty. Schooling is often a precondition for girls and women to stand up against injustice, and a way for them to be integrated into the economy. Until they are literate, it is difficult for them to have a voice and contribute meaningfully to the national economy. Even the smallest contribution can make the largest difference in countries across the globe. Thank you so much for viewing our presentation. We hope that you enjoyed it.